so we're finally to what we call the modern era of art, which is where things really start happening. I like to sometimes joke around that it's where someone just drops a bomb on this kind of fairly linear developing art story that we've been looking at, especially with the focus lately on Western civilization and kind of the paintings and the painters coming out of Europe and all those styles that are developing. So, why is that? Well, in this time period, really, is when the world sees major changes. And a lot of that is due to the Industrial Revolution and the age of the machine coming on board. So, and then we also have a lot of social change and government change, where we have all these countries declaring their independence, monarchies are being overthrown. So, with that, that of course really influences what is being made and what it looks like and why it's being made. So, we have an even wider spectrum of the kind of art that is accepted as, in our cultural tradition from the West as being, really valued and appreciated. It's no longer just kind of what many call the dead white male canon of artists in the world anymore that get recognized. So even today now we're still starting to really look at all different kinds of art making traditions and realizing that it's not that this Western civilization art is better, it's just different. So we're gonna start looking at some of that a bit and how it's influenced, the art that we've been looking at, and then the changes we're about to see. So some of the big changes that affect art, but maybe don't seem so great to you, are things like the camera. That was a big deal for art because before the camera, the only way to have any visual record of a loved one was to have somebody paint them. So all of a sudden, the camera comes along and takes that away. You don't need a painter to paint your family. You have a camera. So that leaves artists with a major gap of wait a second, people don't need us for that anymore. Now what? Then we also have smaller things happening, but really do impact what artists can make and how they make it. Things like paint tubes to store paint in. And then, of course, we have the just greater travel around the world where people are able to move and get to faraway places much more easily, which means they're being exposed to many different kinds of people and styles around the world. And that really just makes them rethink the way that they've been doing things in their cultures back home. So let's jump in. The first thing we're going to look at is actually Japanese printmaking, or ukiyo. And this is a print by Hakusai. He's one of the most famous or more famous Japanese woodblock print artists. And this piece is one of his most famous pieces. So why are we looking at this first? This is kind of setting the tone for, again, what's happening in the world. So European artists were kind of doing their own thing, inspired by the Renaissance artists and kind of the ancients, looking at ancient Greece and Rome for a long time. And it all kind of has some similar traits to it, right? If you think back to the art we've looked at. Well, then they see this and they go, whoa, this looks really different. And the way that this is made, the materials and the process for printmaking is so different than what we've been doing. Maybe we need to rethink, how we're making our art and what we're doing with it. And that's exactly what this kind of art did for them. Because all of a sudden we have this flattening of space. There's no real attempt at creating that illusion of 3D in this image whatsoever. But yet there's so many amazing, beautiful things happening here. And the artists are going to take that and run with it in their own direction. So what happens is that in Europe, and we're going to be focusing in on France for a little while, we have these artists in the 1800s that have seen all this artwork coming out of Japan and other places in the world that is losing that sense of depth and has other things going on that are just visually appealing. It's just cool. So they start playing around with that idea of, well, wait a second, why do we have to make things look so realistic? So Manet is one of the first people to jump on board with that. Now, I've written some things about this painting that just give you a backstory about this. This really is one of the more famous paintings that gets talked about always. You might not love the painting in and of itself, but if you know the background story story and you can appreciate the changes and what he's starting to do in this painting, then it kind of comes alive. So we're going to not focus on the subject matter so much. You can read a bit of that off to the side, or if you want to look it up, you can find out more of what's going on here. But this is a park in Paris that everyone, the landed gentry and the rich and elite would go to just enjoy the outdoors in Paris. But gentlemen would go there during the day and have little liaisons that maybe they weren't supposed to be. And everyone knew that that was happening in Paris, but we kind of looked the other way. So the fact that he paints this and puts it front and center in a major exhibition was really quite shocking to the elite that were going to this art show. So that's why they had such a rejection. They actually tried to rip it off the wall. Anyway, so if we take that backstory and that kind of makes it more interesting to us, we can then look at the painting itself. So if we really look closely, not necessarily at the people, they're very realistic and well done, but even the way the pile of clothes are, and if we look at the greenery in through here, and even off in the distance, what's happening back there, we don't necessarily have this really spot-on perfect reproduction of what this actually would look like in real life. He's getting very loose with his brush strokes. It's getting very more like what we call gestural and impressionistic. And he was doing that on purpose, again, to play with the idea of, does it have to be so realistic, or can I be more expressive with how I'm putting that paint on my canvas? So now we're going to look at the big one. Monet, I think, is probably the Impressionist painter that most of you know. I've chosen these pieces. These aren't his most famous. The water lilies are probably his most famous painting, or the Japanese bridge that's over his pond. But I really love how this spells out what the Impressionists were doing and what they were after with their paintings, where we have the same exact view of this same cathedral in this same city of Rouen in northern France, but painted at these different times of day with different qualities of light. And that's really one of the things that they were so interested in with Impressionism. They were playing with how to put that paint on the canvas, being very loose with their strokes and blending wet on wet paint, and they weren't so consumed with realistic detail as visual effect. And they make for beautiful results. You know, if you've seen these paintings in person up close, you know, they're just these incredible stories of color. And you can see how their hands, or the paintbrush, how their hands move that paintbrush across that canvas to put those brushstrokes on those works of art. And I think we appreciate that. So let's look at another one of our Impressionist painters. So here's Renoir. He's another, again, French painter in Paris. Paris has become the powerhouse place to be, the center of art for much of the world. Artists are flocking there from everywhere to be part of the scene. So Renoir's right in the middle of this, but he was much more focused on people and kind of that genre painting of what are people doing out there in the world. This painting is quite interesting because it's also pointing us towards the social change of France and what's happening in the world. We have people that are more lower class, farmers, working class, mixing with our upper class, landed gentry, you know, people of means. And what's so wonderful about this is everyone is just having a good time and relaxing, and no one cares about, you know, your status. They're just enjoying this wonderful meal out on this boat in this lovely marsh area. So he wanted to capture all of those things in his paintings, but sticking with the idea of Impressionism with very loose brushstrokes, soft edges, everything's blurred out. It's almost like when you look at something really quickly and you get the impression of it in your head and you see everything, but it's not clear. It's not in focus. That's what these paintings make me think of. Now we're going to move on to Mary Cassatt. She's actually an American painter who goes to France and gets trained over there and then comes back here. She was very much interested in, being a woman, in capturing kind of the more domestic, quiet life and women and with their children and what that looked like in homes. And so she has just lots and lots of paintings and pastel drawings, actually, of this kind of subject matter and scenery. Then, of course, we're going to get to Van Gogh. Oops, let me bounce back. So I don't have the Starry Night on here because I wanted to have this picture because it shows more clearly what he actually does with the paint when he puts it on the canvas. And that's one of those things with Van Gogh, unless you get really up close and personal with his pieces over the internet, you can't really see that. But this is actually my photograph that I took in the museum, so there's a bit of a shadow there. But I also took this close up on purpose so you guys could get to see how goopy and wonderfully he's just, I mean, almost throwing the paint on that canvas. I mean, not being careful and just really layering and building up that oil paint. It's so wonderful, and it's like Van Gogh takes that idea of Impressionism and he pushes it even further towards just being really truly expressive for his own creative purposes. Like this is really well beyond realism, and just becomes about the energy that Van Gogh is putting into this painting with his brushstrokes. So now we're going to swing a little bit the other way. We're going to tighten it up. And instead of being so loose with the paint, we have Seurat, who back in France, he is obsessed with color theory and the idea of how our eye perceives color. And so he comes up with this whole theory that, well, what if I just paint lots and lots of little dots and I put them all next to each other? Then you'll be able to see the changes in the painting because your eye will just blend them together, but I don't have to actually blend the paint myself, which is exactly what he does. So this is just thousands and thousands and thousands of tiny little dots of individual colors that Seurat is layering and putting next to each other. And so if he wants to make kind of a muddy brown or a transition tone, look what he's doing. He's putting blues and purples next to oranges. And what happens with that is we read that as kind of this muddied color because they're complements, and our eye can't distinguish these colors once it's far away and we can't see this up close like this, so it just blurs it to this kind of like muddy brown, which is what happens in some of this. So if we zoom in on some of these areas, that's what you would see, but far away it kind of blends together to create the color palette that he wants. He spent like, I'm gonna forget, guys, it's either 8 or 11 years. I think it's 11 years on this painting. It's actually huge. It's the size of the whiteboard in our room. So it's pretty crazy. You have to be a certain personality type to do this, right? Lots of patience. But it really is a beautiful painting. And again, he's able to still create that really soft effect of blending colors and the light, but also very soft edges and just giving us that hint of detail, just enough that we know what's going on here, but we have no idea who this individual person is, and we can't really tell, and that's okay. So that's going to wrap up this video. We're just going to pause here, and that leads us to our chalk pastel masterpiece. So stay tuned for the next video down the road.